Welcome here at the Center of Literature on Burg Hülshoff. Welcome online to the last day of our workshop on post-Westphalian literature. Over the last 2 days, we heard many interesting inputs and presentation about literature that transcends the borders of states and international borders. Often declared as national poets in the past. Here in the foundation, in the Annette von Droste-Hülshoff Foundation, we know that very well, and that is why we are very interested in the question of what happens with a big German poet if that is translated into other languages. What does that translation do to her? And that's what we're looking at in our Trans Droste project. We're going to introduce that project to you today. I am leading that with my colleague Max Körner. We have many experts on board that you already know from the last 2 days. Trans Droste is a digitally based translation lab working on texts of Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. We launched the project at the end of 2020 and now we're in the midst. The project brings a group of translators together who in several sub-labs work in depth on important text from Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. Currently, we are translating it into 6 languages: English, French, Northern Kurdish, Turkish, Farsi, and Arabic. The texts will then be published one by one in the digital castle, where you are maybe watching us right now. What is important to us in the entire project is that in addition to the translation itself, there is space for reflection on the translation and the text and the discourses processed in them. To kick off the second lab, we invited various academics to engage in conversation with the translators. And the results of one of those workshops is something that you were able to watch yesterday, or you were able to listen to it yesterday. That was the feature that we heard yesterday or last night, that audio feature about the sounds from the Orient. In the first lab of Trans Droste, which we call the landscape, which is the landscape lab, we translated typical Droste poems into English. Shane Anderson, Daniel Falb, Monika, Rinck, and Annie Rutherford were on board there. The texts that we translated there were primarily concerned with rural life in Westphalia, around Burg Hülshoff. So the texts actually were about the places that Annette von Droste-Hülshoff knew from her life and wrote about. In the second sub-lab of Trans Droste, we're going to look at sounds from the Orient. That is something that we looked at in this workshop closely as well. And in this lab, we will try to get to create a dialogue between Droste-Hülshoff and the actual spaces and realities that hide behind the term of Orient. We are not only translating into English and French, but also into Comanche, Turkish, Arabic, and Farsi. Barbara Fontaine, Şahin, Kürküt, Kaouther, Tabai, Tevfik Turan, Mehmet Hosseini are the team of translators. And today we have 3 translators here with us today. They are here or they're coming to us live via internet. Annie Rutherford, Kaouther, Tabai are here online, and Mahmoud Hosseini is here in person. Kaouther Tabai is translator, author, and computer scientist. She has published several volumes of short stories with the Frankfurt-based Claret Verlag, including her debut work, The Little Maid, Das kleine Dienstmädchen. She She has a particular affinity for translating poetry. She translated, for example, Carnations in the Night of Her Hair, a book of poems by Syrian poet Sa Quadri from Arabic into German, and most recently the poetry collection The Songs Aren't at Fault Here was published by her. Annie Rutherford is coming to us from Edinburgh, not from Berlin, as Kaouther Tabai. She's a translator and writer who works as Associate Director of Stanza, Scotland's International Poetry Festival. She's a presenter at Free Words, an occasional podcast on queer poetry, and she's a fiction editor at the literary magazine The Interpreter's House. Translating, she devotes most her time to poetry from German, in German, and has translated Nora Gomminger, Klinger Tod, Maren Kames, and Levin Mestermann. Mahmoud is writer and literary translator. After studying political science in Munich, he worked in various positions, including the Iranian television and radio, and he also worked as a translator at the German embassy in Tehran. He also was a professor at the university in Tehran. He wrote and published 4 collections of stories and 1 novel in Iran. And in 2013, he received the Goethe Medal of the Goethe Institute for his translations of contemporary literature. Now I would like to give the floor to our translators directly. I would like to start with a question to all of you. When you translate the classics, which Annette von Droste-Hülshoff's work undoubtedly falls under, you always face the problem that you're not only translating into another language, but also into another time. In our case, you're translating into the 21st century. What was it like for you to translate Annette von Droste-Hülshoff? Was it difficult or easy for you to find an approach to her and her texts? I would like to propose that you start, Annie, because you have been on board the longest, really. Yeah, it's different, I'd say. Most of the time, I translate people who are alive most of the time. Actually, I have only translated for people that are still alive, and then I can talk to them, I can argue with them. If there's something that I don't understand, I can contact them directly. And if the author has been dead for 250 years, then that's not possible. That was the biggest challenge for me. Also, generally, I work with people that I know their voice, I know what they sound like. And that is very important for me. When I translate, I need to be able to recreate their voice. And with Droste, you have to imagine a little bit what her voice could have sounded like. But that also creates a freedom. You can be a bit more playful. You can often have that feeling, I need to be modern now. That's like a pressure. And that's something that didn't exist in this regard. And I was able to write things that don't fit with our time. Kaouther, how was it for you? Well, I knew Hülshoff from a book that talked about women who wrote. So she wasn't totally unknown to me, but I would never have thought of translating her poems. I didn't know her poems before. So when you approached me, when you asked me, that was a new task for me. I would have never, by myself, have had the idea to translate authors from other centuries. If I had done that, I probably would have looked for authors from my own culture. But I thought that this was a challenge that was really interesting to me. And when I started working, we started on the fall of the Barmacides, and I saw that I was really in my element, because that story had a huge impression on me when I was a child. So it was not difficult to get into it at all. The next poems were also very accessible to me, but I don't know how this is going to go on. I think the next poems are going to be bigger challenges. But yeah, the first poems were really great. I'm enthusiastic about it. Yeah, maybe to give you some background, we started with 3 poems from Sounds of the Orient, Heartfelt, Du goldgesticktes Zelt, and The Fall of the Barmekins. Mahmoud, how did you get into Droste? How did you experience it? Well, first of all, I need to say thank you. Yesterday, I didn't even thank you for having me, for inviting me, so I'm going to do that today. Thank you for having me in this project. I didn't get into it at all, I must say, because when I translate, I do that in a very distanced way. So I'm very distanced from Droste and her time, and then I go via the author and approach the subject via the author. I use secondary literature, and yeah, Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, I didn't know her. And when I taught this process in university, a student approached me. She wanted to work on Drostes' work Judenbuche. And as for my strategy, I did the same thing you did. I have my own theory. I have translated for half a century, and I developed my own theory, I'd say. For classics and also for poems, that is something that I very seldomly do. For example, for once, we wanted to translate the collected works of Bertolt Brecht. That didn't work out in the end, but we worked on many of his poems, and we developed our own theory for doing that. So, but what do? I do the same thing that Droste did. Droste sat here in this castle in the Münsterland area. She thought about the Orient. And it was very abstract for her. And that's exactly what I do. I take her poems into my room, to my desk. And, for example, when we sat down together online, some of my colleagues said that they have a tapestry that shows Venice, and that can also be a source of inspiration. When I translate with distance.
Yes, there is this tapestry that shows scenes of the Naples harbor. I'm not really sure about that. But yes, that still exists, I think, doesn't it? Yes, exactly. And I had that in my own mind, and then I translate. Yeah, that goes really well with the rooms where we are right now. There are many interesting wallpapers here as well, and I think the setting is very fitting. It's quite inspiring, I think. Okay, but back to the first part of the lab, the translation into English. Annie, it was 4 of you working on the translation. You with Jane Anderson, Daniel Falb, and Monika Rinck. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the cooperation within the team. Of course, I'd love to. First of all, thank you, but there's a family living on top of my flat, and I think that their child is currently jumping around. I hope that's not a problem. But yes, it was 4 of us, and it was very interesting. What we did is we said, okay, each one of us deals with a third of the amount of the text and translates that himself or herself, and ended up with a version of the translation. But that wasn't the final version, of course. And then we sat down in teams of 2. So each one of us chose a partner, and we went through our texts, through the translations, talked about them, commented them. And yeah, sometimes we were like, okay, I was very irritated at that point. I didn't know how to deal with this part. And then the other person maybe brought in his or her own idea. And then the first person would revise his or her version with those comments. And then the 4 of us looked at it, at the texts, and I think it took us about 3 hours to talk about the 4 poems. So yeah, it was thorough, definitely. And yes, we looked at each word, at each term, and any moment where one of us maybe felt like we were too far away from the original text. So we really looked at that, and it was very interesting because every time we revised the text, the perspective sort of got broader and we understood even more about the text. So for myself, I know that we all have very different ideas. And if we would have worked in teams of twos, then it would have been difficult. But as a group of four, it worked really well. It was very balanced and it was an interesting task. I was there. I participated in quite a few of the meetings that took place via Zoom. And it was very impressive to see how much work and how much time you put into that work. We had a meeting like that for sounds from the Orient. And, well, in this project, we are working at translating the poems into different languages, not just into one. So, Mahmoud and Kaouther, I would have liked to ask the two of you how you experienced it to sit there and have that exchange with the translators that translate into other languages. What was it like for you? Okay, I'll start. So for me, it was a great experience to work with the other translators. It was a very enriching experience. It made me broaden my perspective. It made me understand how the others work. It was very interesting to see what they understood, what they didn't understand, have an exchange about that. And yes, also to learn about the other languages, learn about the characteristics and the specificities of the other translations. And if you look at the examples of the poems that we started with, then I have to say I thought it was very productive. There were some parts, sometimes, parts of the poems where it was very difficult to work with that. But because we had the exchange, we managed to always find a solution. And I really enjoyed the experience. Compared to my usual work, when I work on my own on a translation, I think, yes, I enjoyed it. I think it's something that any translator would enjoy, really. And also, getting to know the other languages was something that I really enjoyed. What was it like for you, Mahmoud? Yes, it was similar. All four of us, Turkish, Kurmanji, Farsi, and Arab, all four languages come from the same region almost. And the feeling that I had was that all four of us know that we know a region that Droste didn't know herself. We know that she sat here and wrote about our region. And yes, that was a very abstract way of writing. And I think that's something that was interesting for all four of us. I saw that in the translations. We worked with Arabic and with Kurdish translators, and the terms, the words, the translations sometimes were similar. That was an experience that we all shared. So four from a region translate a poet that came from a different region, and I think that's something we had in common. Annie, would you like to add something to that? Sorry. I just wanted to say something quite very briefly. I learned that the word wa and the Arab wa also exists in Turkish. There were other terms as well in Persian that were very similar. There are many things that we have in common. Sorry. I'm done. Annie looked like she wanted to add something. No, not really. I was done, but I just thought it was extremely interesting. English, of course, is not that doesn't have anything in common with the other languages, but nonetheless we have those questions and we learn about things that we never even thought of because somebody all of a sudden says, okay, what was that in that stanza? And then you think, oh yeah, good point. Maybe I should think a little bit more about that. It's very helpful in that process. Okay, and a question for you, Annie. In the first part of the Landscape Lab, you mainly translated text dealing with Westphalia into English. And the provocative question would now be, translating Westphalia, is that even possible? Do regional characteristics still make sense when they are translated into completely different languages or spaces? What would you say? That is a very good question, and I have to admit that I've never been to North Rhine-Westphalia. That is why maybe I can't even answer this question. I always had the impression that those poems, for me, are sort of transfer a British atmosphere. So those castles, those ruins, those empty landscapes, those voids, you know, they're not empty, but they seem like it, despite the fact that there's so much happening. That's something we know in Scotland, in northern England. So I thought, that's why I thought it was very fitting. In our group talks, I was always the one who said, no, let's stick to this image because it describes an atmosphere that I know from my own culture, the culture that I grew up in. But of course, there's this poem called Der Heidemann. And it's a strange poem because on the one hand, it says it's not about ghosts, it's not about the fog. But apart from this footnote, there is no information on that ghost, this apparently known ghost. So really, I didn't know what solution we could find for that legend, for that story. But we talked a lot about that. And we really tried to understand how we could turn that into another sort of folk stories. There are so many different folk stories in Ireland, for example, about ghosts, for example, that come from the fog. And we really thought about maybe taking them or actually not taking them, because then it would have become something Irish. That was a bit of a tricky question. And so, yes, we said we call it the Heathman. It's a very direct translation that has nothing really to do with local folk tales. I think that was a good decision, but who knows? Sauerländer was another term that was difficult. She talked about the people from the Sauerland with a lot of humor, and that's very difficult to translate. I would have suggested we talk about the people from Yorkshire, but the others didn't agree on that. So, yeah, it's always a matter of, of discussion. But I think, yes, it is possible to translate it. You have to think a lot about it, but it does work. I remember that too. I remember that discussion. And now the opposite question to Mahmoud and Kaouther. In Sounds from the Orient, Annette von Droste-Hülshoff describes the Orient. So it's a very Eurocentric understanding of a place that doesn't even exist in that way, a sort of projection. As Edward Said says, that region doesn't actually exist. And how do you deal with that in translation? What strategies did you come up with to deal with this issue? What ideas? You talked about it a little bit at the beginning, Mahmoud. Maybe you would like to answer that question? If you come from a region, like the region where I come from, if you're from Iran, for example, and if you, like me, then study political sciences in Germany and then work in Iran, then you sort of have a pessimistic attitude towards what we call orientalism. There is a saying in Persian saying, no cat catches a mouse in order to get God's approval. And I agree with that. I don't think Christopher Columbus went to wanted to go to India because he loves the Indians. No, there's so many people who tried well, who tried their best. The museums in the Western countries are now full of our artifacts, of our art pieces. I have so much respect towards all those grand masters. I don't want to show a lack of respect, but I'm not sure. Burgstall wanted to become a diplomat in Istanbul and then learned about the literature. Or Rinck, we heard the performance of Salim translated from 40 languages. Goethe did everything in his life, botanics, everything. And then he says, okay, now I'm going to try Hafiz, and I'll write that book. It's a wonderful book. And with Droste, I have the feeling, and we heard about that yesterday and the day before, that she had problems with herself, with her environment, with her father, and so on. And she wanted to liberate herself and thought about the Orient. And then she wrote that piece of art. And I have to admit, I didn't read much about Droste. I don't know whether she's that brutal in her other poems or whether she isn't. Whether this horror, whether she chose the Orient in order to write these brutal stories, and then for the German audience she wrote religious poems. I don't know. So whenever orientalists come in, join the group, then I'm sort of skeptical. But I will be very neutral at translating Droste. I won't bring my fantasy or my mind play a big role here. But how to achieve that? Well, I said I try to keep my distance, and we met online at some point, and then I said, I think the poems that we worked with so far, that's more of a prose for me. And for me, as someone from Iran who lived with poetry for his whole life, then I would say, yes, there are some poetic moments in her poems. The Fall of the Barmakids, that's a prose, it's a tale for me. And that's easier for me. That's how I translate it. And something else that has to do with myself. Yesterday, the day before, I didn't hear much about it, and I didn't find anything about it online. So I tried to research online. The first translation of 1001 Nights took place in 1824, 1825. And Droste was 1835, I think, more or less. And I think she read 1001 Nights and not that much poetry. I'm sure Goethe wrote Iranian poetry and then wrote his divan. But I think Droste was influenced by 1001 Nights. It's a children's story. It's a story full of horror, full of cruelty when you read that book. And that's what Droste also does. And yesterday it was said that she wanted revenge, and that's why she wrote those brutal stories. But I think she was inspired by 1001 Nights. Does anybody know about that? Did she know the book?
I think we can't answer that with 100% certainty. We can't prove it. Right. But if you see the elements in the poems, in Iranian, Persian poetry, we don't have salespeople, we don't have gardeners, we don't have those figures. That is all included in 1001 Nights. Hassan, we don't have that name in our poetry. In 1001 Nights, it exists. So I suspect that she oriented herself towards 1001 Nights. And that is important to know for me, because I can translate her poems better if I know that 1001 Nights were a source of inspiration. Maybe we can come back to that thesis, but I would like to ask you, Kaouther, to tell us how you deal with that topic of the Orient and this issue. Well, in the beginning, I thought, yeah, now I'm going to translate a poet from the 19th century from Germany, a poet that wrote about the Orient. Let's see what she's going to write. I was very interested to see that. I think Edward Said's saying is very fitting for me as a German orientalist. He says the stories, the connections between Orient and Occident are burdened with Orientalism because it's a false view of the Orient. If I turn inwards, however, if I look into myself, yes, that point about 1001 Nights, that's exactly what I thought as well. Droste pictured what she had seen. And for me, that Orient that Droste created, for me, such an Orient exists as well. I have an Orient like that in my head, in my fantasy, in my feeling. An Orient that doesn't really exist, only exists in me. And that was also created by 1001 Nights. So with these contexts in time and space, understanding the poet, a woman, back then, she was a poet, but she wasn't recognized. She had not the opportunity to actually fulfill her wants, and we can talk about whether everyone would have reacted in the same way as she did. Maybe there would have been opportunities to rebel against that stringent corset. So I don't really know. I'm a bit divided. The way she sees the Orient and the way she depicts it in her poems, that is also a part that I find that in myself as well, in my image of the Orient as well. Of course, that's not a depiction of the Orient that existed. The time is shortly after the fact that Napoleon embarked to Egypt. There were those archaeological digs in Egypt. The Arabic world was fashionable. It was the time of colonialism. It was the beginning of colonialism, really. And if I think about the poet, if I think about her, she, in her village, in her surrounding, I have to look at what did she read, what did she look at. So there was also a yearning for that faraway place in her. That's what I saw in her poetry. Yeah, I think that's very fitting. I would like to talk about another aspect, because the discussions that we are having here right now are supposed to be part of the project. And one opportunity to share that with others is the Droste glossary, in which we have different entries that describe characteristics of Droste-Hülshoff's texts from the point of view of the translators. It is prepared for a broader audience. It's informative and entertaining. For example, you can read about strange word endings, punctuation in her poems. Annie, you brought us a couple of entries of that glossary. Maybe you could read them out to us. Yes. Do you want me to read them out, or do you want me to talk about the glossary first? Why don't you read the first entry, and then you can maybe talk about it a little bit. How did you come to write those glossary entries? Yeah. I'd love to. This is an entry that was written by Monika Rinck, another translator, who's also a poet. It plays with language a little bit. It's not translatable. It's called Spook and Booze.
Mind, Soul. Sagen wir Mind oder sagen wir Soul? Meint ihr nicht Mind? Mind hätte sich nämlich sogar gereimt. Nein, es ist Soul. Wohl ist es Soul. Are you sure? Ja, ich bin sure. Dann müssen wir schauen, dass wir was finden, das im Rhythmus bleibt und doch auf Seele reimt. No, Gespenster are unlike good Geister. Jedes Mal, wenn ich Geist als Spirit übersetze, kommt Mind angerannt und bringt sich erneut ins Spiel. Spirit hätte doch etwas immer von Spuk und Schnaps, genau, besoffene Wiedergänger. Spiritistische Sitzungen, klappende Läden. Wie heißt es denn bei Hegel? Moment. The Phenomenology of Spirit or the Phenomenology of Mind, published in 1807. Dankeschön. Spirit oder Mind. Spirit ist gebräuchlicher. Sicher ist Spirit gebräuchlicher als Mind. Nicht wie du meinst. Spirit ist on my mind. Genau. Und also ich glaube wirklich, dass Monika
Yes, I think Monika actually captured conversations that we had and transformed them into a little play, you could really say. In this entry, it was about how can we translate the German word Geist. It could be mind, it could be soul, it could be brain, it could also be a ghost, or it could be the spirit, such as the Holy Spirit, or soul. So there's multiple ways to translate it. And that really captures one of those moments where we were sitting there and we didn't know how to get out of that situation and what to do with it. So these problems where you get stuck, and these problems then find their way into the Droste glossary. There's one entry that is longer than the others, and it's called The Four Horsemen of Poetry Translation. It only exists in English, actually. It has not been translated into German. Annie, could you explain to us what those four horsemen of poetry translation are? I can try. Şahin wrote it. And it takes that idea from the last book. What's it called? The Revelation of Johannes. The last book in the Bible. The Revelations, of course. So and that is really what it's about. It's the end of the world. There's the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that was Şahin's idea. He took those horsemen, and those horsemen aren't about death, sickness, and war. It's about aspects in translation. And sometimes you have these ideas that come from pop culture. You have to make a decision, and you have the little demon on one shoulder, and you have the angel on the other shoulder, and they tell you their ideas. They tell you why you should be evil now, why you should be good right now. And I think that's what was in Şahin's mind, that there's many different voices that try to tell you what you're supposed to do now when you translate. And I know that from myself. When I translate, I have that voice in my head that tells me, no, but you're straying too far from the source material here. And the other voice tells me, but it's not good English what you're producing here. So that's what that was about. But it was also about the fact that the four of us had very different perspectives. And Daniel, for example, always said, but semantically speaking, this is wrong. So Şahin actually picked four aspects of translation, and that's the four superheroes. There's Semantics Man, someone who talks about semantics a lot, and there's Meta. They think about the meta level. Then there's Florist, It's there about having a translation that is really nice and beautiful. And then there's the gambler, so someone who gambles, who runs risks. And that's the translator who says, hey, let's do away with the source material. Let's interpret this in a new way. And yeah, the idea is that you have to make ideas and then stick with them. That's the 4 aspects. And that reflected a bit the 4 people who were in the first lab. Yes, and I think it describes a problem that all translators know, I would say, that glossary. And that entry into the glossary and the entire glossary will be available on the Digital Castle. We are still constructing the website right now. Not everything is online yet, but it will be online very soon and open to the public. We heard that there's different perspectives on translating, there's different roles. So we could say, or we could ask, what role do you feel closest to? But I think that most translators can't even answer that question because they try to hear all the 4 voices and try to balance them out. In conclusion to our conversation, I would like to ask you the question, maybe let's get serious again. What would you say makes up the writing of Droste? What was the most difficult to translate into your language? Mahmoud, maybe you would like to start. There's always problems. Not only when translating Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, but translating in general. If I would start translating the Süddeutsche Zeitung, a big German newspaper, if I translate that into Persian or Farsi, that would be an issue because German, Farsi, and Persian have 0 overlap. They have nothing in common. They share nothing. For example, in our language, we don't have genders. We don't know masculine, feminine, neutrum. So an Iranian can live for 100 years. They will never be able to construct a German passive sentence. They will never be able to formulate a German conjunctive. The grammar is completely different. Vocabulary is also very different. If you live in the north of Tehran, you speak a different Persian than if you live in the south of Tehran. If you are a taxi driver in Tehran, you have a different language than a salesperson. So we always face these problems. The way we write is something we never speak. So there's a theater, German, of course, but no one speaks as they write. That's always the case, whether it's the president or anyone else. If we look at Droste's work, a classic, a very local classic, there are problems. And you helped us a lot with many terms that we didn't know at all, like the dry mouths. That was an allusion to Maultier. And yeah, I thought it was about dry mouths, right? But no, it was about camels. That was a wordplay on the German word for camel. So there are these images that exist there. And yeah, and then on the grammatical level, there's also a problem. There's also problems. But speaking about the 4 horsemen, I think we need a fifth one. That's the horseman that translates correctly. Because I would say, so the florist, that is a bit pejorative, the way we use it, but maybe that's the right thing. I always reference Schleiermacher when I was young. Schleiermacher says the reader must become the author and the author must become the reader. And I always tried to move author and reader and make it possible that they meet in the middle somewhere.
Oh, very interesting to hear that. Thank you for that background information. Kaouther, what would you say? What was a specific problem when it comes to translating those texts? Like I said, the beginning was pretty easy. I've been living in Germany for quite a while, but of course the German language has really changed. So for me, okay, I had to understand what was meant at the beginning, and like Mahmoud said, the mouths that were just mentioned, that was very strange for me to hear. I thought of, yes, a dry mouth. Anyone could have a dry mouth. But yes, those 4 horsemen, I gotta say, I only understood that today, what was behind all that. I think any translator knows the conflict between the 4 aspects. It's not something that you're aware of, but of course you want to harmonize everything. You want to make sure that each one of them feels represented. And the translator is always a traitor, no matter what he or she does. We can try our best, and it pays off, even if we are traitors. So I would say the metrum, well, no, forget about that. I don't care about that. If I would try to keep the metrum, then my fantasy would get lost, the meter. Semantics, for me, is more important. I focus on that. And the rest, that's kind of a game. And the florist is very important, of course. The translation in the target language has to sound as natural, as fluent as possible. So I don't want it to be rigid. Yes, it's translated, but I want it to be fluid and natural. I think Droste's work, for me so far, there weren't that many conflicts for me, but I can imagine that the other poems, like the short poems with a lot of adjectives, this is going to be tricky for me to translate that into Arab. The adjectives, they sort of have a different weight. And yeah, to find a balance there, that will be tricky, will be challenging. That was my statement. Annie, what about you? I just really had to laugh because I really like the meters, and I know that Şahin thought about me when he wrote the meter maid. That's me. So the difficulties I encountered were mainly in the first texts, the landscape group, where Droste really worked a lot with the meter and with rhymes. And the meter, for me, is the engine of the poem. So I thought it was very interesting to try to keep that alive. But it is interesting because in English, for example, certain meters work really well and others do not work at all. And then the question is, of course, whether you can change the rhythm in order to make sure that it stays fluid, or if you want to stick to it, if you want to stick to what Droste used. So I really enjoy the meters. Rhymes are very difficult for me. And Droste was very rigid and partly, yeah, in part she was very strict when it came to the rhymes. And I think that really brings us to the question about how to translate texts into the 21st century. There, for me, it was really important to make sure that the idea, the feeling of those poems stays alive. They are rhymed poems, so that's important, but you don't want to write a poem that today sort of sounds like a parody of a 19th century poem. So I think today we don't work as much with rhymes, so that is sort of a risk to stick to the rhymes. I tried to work with semi-rhymes. That was sort of my private solution. But yeah, it was challenging. It was a bit of a struggle. And you also said that it's not that easy to transfer trochees into English. Exactly. In German, a trochee is a verse where you have a strong syllable and then a weak syllable. And in German, that works really well because we have all those words, deine, meine, ihre. You can start a verse or a stanza with that, and then the endings of the words, like any adjective usually ends with a weak syllable, oder, or meiner, alter. All those are examples in German for trochees. All of them are trochees. It's very natural in German. But in English, in English, iams are very natural for us. I can talk in iams without thinking about it, but if I want to use trochees, then I have to work hard, and it always sounds sort of stiff. So I try to translate the trochees into iams because it just makes more sense. It sounds better, I would say. Thank you very much for those impressions. And thank you for letting us take a glance sort of behind the stage and finding out about what happens when texts are translated. You now have the opportunity to ask our translators anything also via the chat. That's why, I'd say let's have a look at the questions. Okay, no questions? Oh yeah, there's one question. Very good. Hi, I do have a question to the Farsi translator and the Arabic translator. In the texts, there are words like muezzin, Allah, mosque, jinn, and that sort of leads to the German reader feeling feeling like he reads about something from far away, foreign, but that doesn't apply to the Arab reader. So how can that feeling be transported? That feeling that a German reader has when he or she reads those poems. How can we transfer that so that Arab readers can also enjoy that? That's a very good question. So far, we haven't had that problem with the muezzin. And yes, of course, it does have a different sound in German than it does in Arabic. So I don't know what solution we'd have to find for that. Yes, the problem exists. With those poems, there's nothing you can do. Also, because of jinn, I said, I'm sure that Droste was inspired by 1001 Nights. Yesterday, we talked to our friends here, and I'm not naming anyone right now, but a very good friend of mine wanted me to translate her novel into Persian, and I said, that's not possible. Your novel is interesting for the German audience, but everything you describe in your novel is our daily life in Iran, so it's simply not interesting for us. Larger project, there it's easy because you can simply say, no, we're not doing that. But here it's difficult. So maybe you can create an atmosphere with words so that the mosque or the jinn, that's there. I know that the men in those poems, they're all called Hassan. Our president is called Hassan. Many people, many men, old men are called Hassan, but not young people. So that's why I think you have to create a poetic atmosphere, an atmosphere of words to make sure that it makes sense. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do. Yes, we also had this problem with the names. The name example, the Malmuna, Zila, those names that she chose. How to translate that into Arabic, that's a conflict, because you can't project it 100% the way that she intended it in her time. Yes, the lover of Barmaki is Abbasi. And for some reason, Droste chose Meyune, and I would simply leave that out. That might help a little bit, so that the Iranian reader understands that she wants to describe something foreign. We do have another question. Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to you talk about what you dealt with in that lab. And I thought it was very interesting to hear about 1001 Nights and how that could have been an inspiration. Ottmar Ette talked about that yesterday. He said that it's a collection that was probably written and created in India. So it's already a projection into a different space, that Orient that was created there, that was invented there, is a fairy tale. It is a projection. Droste, you can see that there are those multiple distances. In her text, Die Judenbuche, she talks about a place that she knows geographically, Eastern Westphalia, not Münsterland, where we are right now, but nonetheless Westphalia. But she describes it in a different time. So she introduces a certain distance, and then she tries to tell a story that she knows from what her uncle had told her about, and she also uses her fantasy. And I think what it's really about is that a criminal case simply can't be solved, but that people sort of project everything. And I would say that, yes, it's about intertextuality, so relating, connecting texts to other texts. We learn writing by reading, and it's not a game. Nonetheless, we're still responsible when we translate. We have to look at the context, but nonetheless, it's also, we're allowed to play with projections. Is that something that you could say, that you would say is acceptable, or do you disagree? Maybe the question is too suggestive, but the matter of phantasmas, projections that can be found there, isn't that always the case? And how open are we when it comes to dealing with that? Yes, I think what's written there is enough. 1001 Nights, I would say. Yes. I think 2 days ago we talked about that. It's called 1001 Nights. Apparently, it was written in Iran. There's a classic called 1000 Fairy Tales. And 1000 Fairy Tales, that apparently was transported to India, and then it arrived back in Iran. But no matter whether it was Indian or Persian, I think, I enjoy translating Droste. So far, we always only saw that love for the Orient at Goethe. So 4 or 5 translations of Goethe can be found in Iran. Of course, not everybody in Iran reads Goethe, but nonetheless, I think it is nice. And now it's nice to also have an alternative. And I would say that right now, I can say, if the Iranians, if people in Iran read those poems, Droste's poems, they all think about 1001 Nights, because all the elements can be found in there, like the vultures, for example. All this exists in 1001 Nights, and I think the Iranian readers will associate it. They will make that connection, and therefore this atmosphere will be created.
Annie, you would like to add something? Yes. And of course, it's a completely different dynamic if you translate the sounds from the Orient into English. And Jörg, maybe I misunderstood your question, but I think about it a lot. What does it mean to translate ethically? I think translators have a responsibility about what they translate, who they translate. Translating is always political. There's 2 or 3 poems that I translated of contemporary artists, and I talked to them, and I approached them and said, hey, there's a huge stereotype in your poem here, and that's not always well received. And then we often reworked the English version. And in the English version, for example, we did away with that stereotype or that cliché. So in the end, you always have to think about the ethics in translating. And that's more difficult if you can't engage in a direct conversation with the author. I have no answer how to deal with this issue, but I think it's something that we need to reflect on while translating. That's the very least. That Droste did project when she wrote these poems, and that we carry that along when we work on the poems. That's a lovely conclusion, I would say, for our conversation. And it's also a perfect bridge to our next point of the agenda, our last panel, and that is called Political Dimensions of Translation. We're going to have that panel at 5:30 today. Thank you, Kaouther Tabai, Mahmoud, Hosseini, Annie Rutherford. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us that impression of your work, giving us that insight. Thank you for the audience. Thank you to the team as well. And we'll see you again at 5:30 for the last panel.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this last panel of the workshop on research and writing in the post-Westphalian order. This panel is called Political Dimensions of Translation, and we want to look at three questions. Can translation live up to the expectation of acting as a mediator between cultures? How do literary translators deal with the traces of orientalist and colonialist thinking in classics? And to what extent is translation itself related to colonialism? We will explore these questions in this panel together with the writer, translator, and lecturer Monika Rinck joining us from Vienna, with the philosopher, one might call him, with Şahin Kürküt. He studied philosophy. He is also a teacher for the Kurdish language and a translator. He translates from German to Kurdish. And with Dr. Johannes Salim Ismaiel-Wendt, professor for sociology of music and popular music studies at the University of Hildesheim. My name is Larissa Bender, and I'm a literature translator of Arabic into German and a lecturer in Arabic. I'm going to start with a short introduction. After that, we prepared three inputs, like in the last panel. And before the inputs, I'm going to introduce the speakers briefly. In 2020, in the German book market, there were about 9,164 translations, so 30.2% of the first editions. 63.1% of them were translated from English, and then only 10.6% from French and 10% from Japanese mangas, for example, mainly. Other languages were led by Italian with 2.4%. Languages of the Oriental language area, such as Arabic, Turkish, Persian, or Kurdish, aren't even mentioned in these statistics. What is interesting, however, is the other side, the licensing of German titles abroad. China has the largest share of 20.3%, followed by Turkey with 8.1%, and then Russia with 7.4%. China, Turkey, Russia. Three states with an internal structure that holds considerable potential for political conflict, possibly also with regard to translations. In this respect, the question whether translations per se serve to build bridges to other cultures is justified, whether they foster mutual understanding, and assuming that this is the case, is every translation per se good, simply because the transfer from one language to another leads to a change of perspective that perhaps and even promotes the cohesion of culture and thus of the world? And in what space does translation actually take place? Even if translators are only too happy to evoke the image of their life spent in a lonely study, they quite often enter into fields of political tension that may influence the translation in terms of choice of words, attitude, and style. But in the worst case, it can also lead to them being killed for doing their work, as happened to Hitoshi Igarashi, the Japanese translator of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, who was killed on the 11th of July 1991 as a result of Khomeini's fatwa against the author, Rushdie, and all his supporters. The Italian translator of the Satanic Verses narrowly survived an assassination attempt. The last politically charged discussion about the work of translators took place in Europe at the beginning of the year, when the US poet Amanda Gorman read her poem, The Hill We Climb, at the inauguration of US President Joe Biden. The poem was quickly translated into several European languages. In the discussion that followed the choice of the translator into Dutch, Marieke Lucas-Reinfeldt, who subsequently resigned the commission, and the question of who was actually suitable to translate certain texts or poems became a very urgent one. The activist Janice Doyle, who had sparked the protest through an article in the Volkskrant, had questioned why a translator, in this case Marieke Lucas-Reinfeldt, no experience of an identity as a black woman and no experience in spoken word art had been chosen. Suddenly, it was questioned who was actually allowed to translate what, and whether a certain identity or affiliation of the translator was a prerequisite for the ability to empathize with other people of their identities or affiliations. The Creoles was withdrawn from the assignment because, he said, he didn't, or it was said, he did not have the right profile as he was white and 60 years old. By the way, he had finished translating the poem at that point. The debate was extremely heated, and the repercussions are still strongly felt in translator circles today. This discussion also seamlessly fit in with the very urgent discussions on how to deal with certain terminology previously adopted without thought that degrades the dignity of other people, regardless of their identity. For example, class, race, gender, #MeToo, or We Too. This has partly undermined society's own self-image, but also that of translators who for many decades and centuries moved thoughtlessly in the bubbles of their own culture. Most translators have accepted the challenge and come out in the open with their reflections, which is also the case here in this workshop. They discuss and question their own handling of their language and look for solutions in exchange with others. The question is, for example, how we can literally integrate the term people of color into a novel. We still don't have a literal language for certain terms. So translation seems to be politically. But does it really play a mediating role between cultures? Or does translation, on the contrary, promote colonialism? And what function has translation taken on in the times of colonialism and post-colonialism? Can translation be neutral? Maybe more than ever before. Why are there so many new translations in German? By the way, Edward Said's book Orientalism also underwent a new translation in 2009 by Hans-Günther Holl, who, however, calls the term Islamic scholar Islamists. That's how he translated that term. And how do translators from German into other languages relate to texts from colonial times and the associated longing for the Orient that many European artists and writers felt or believed they had? How should such Orientalisms, and here we come full circle to the work Sounds from the Orient by Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, be transmitted and translated? Do we always need a critical way of commenting artworks because dealing with language has become more sensitive and it's full of traps? I would like to ask Monika Rinck to start with her presentation, to start with her input. Monika Rinck lives and works in Berlin and in Vienna. Like I said, she's joining us virtually from Vienna. Together with Ursula Kalla, she translates from the Hungarian language, she cooperates with musicians, and she teaches in Vienna at the University of Applied Arts. She published multiple books, poems, a book with lectures that is called Wirksame Fiktionen. In 2020, she gave a lecture on the title Vorhersagen, Poesie and Prognose. And for the Trans-Droste project, Monika Rinck, together with Annie Rutherford, Shane Anderson and Daniel Falb, translates the Droste texts from Westphalia, as we heard in the last panel. And in the second part of the project, she's going to translate the poem cycle Sounds from the Orient. She was awarded multiple awards. I just want to name two. This year in 2021, she received the Berlin Literature Prize Award. And together with the translator Ursula Kalla, she received the Erlanger Literatur Award for poetry. as a translation, and in the winter of 2021, a new edition of the so-called Begriffsstudio 1 bis 5000 will be published with new comments, new poems, new essays. Maybe you could just quickly talk a little bit about what a Begriffsstudio 1 bis 5000 means. Monika Rinck, please. The Begriffsstudio, the studio of understanding, that's a bit irritating. Sorry, I can't see myself speak. Okay, you can hear me. So this studio of terminology, of understanding, is a collection of terms in different languages. Some of them were generated by translation mistakes, and I've been collecting these terms, and now I am going to publish them. Spectre Books is the publisher. And I think they can also be found online, right? Exactly. The terms 1 to 5,000, so from 1,000 onwards, they are all online, but the comments are partly only in the book. Oh, we're very much looking forward to your input. Yes, okay, so many questions. And I'm quite intimidated because I won't be able to answer all those questions. Only a tiny fragment of the questions will be answered. I think the contextualization of terms, of languages, that is something that we should really focus on. Because you don't just translate a term, you translate a term in a certain era, in a certain time, in a constellation, and with a meaning at the beginning. So the inauguration would have had to be translated as well. We are looking at very specific poetry, and that makes the whole field even more complicated. When I talk about Orientalism, I think of a historical term, something that in the 19th century was transformed again and again. But if we look at the present, the discussion about fundamentalist Islamism could also be referred to as a sort of Orientalism. So it's a very diverse term that also has its own counter terms, and they are also existent. So how can I deal, or how can I become aware of those insecurities when it comes to translation? Can it even be an advantage when a term is very vague, an insecure term that isn't really defined in a rigid way when I use it? And the same applies to political processes that I think sometimes carry translation conflicts within them. When I think of negative qualities like insecurity, panic, fear, that once talked about an alienation from wage work, changing ourselves, reinventing ourselves, that is a possibility that people have. Then we once again find terms that are between euphemisms and dysphemisms. At the same time, I never have the full control over the semantics of my own terms in just one language. But when I want to speak, I have to accept that. I can say no to wrong translations by philologically analyzing them, by talking to other translators, by, for example, stopping a process and saying, hang on, we're looking at a different term here. You misunderstood it. We have to rethink what is going on.
Und da auf Präzision zu setzen, ist natürlich auch ein politischer Impuls.
So that is an impulse.
Auf der anderen Seite haben wir
On the other hand,
enorm viele Formen der
we have
manipulativen
many
Aneignung,
forms of manipulative appropriation,
absichtlichen oder
willful
unabsichtlichen
or maybe accidental appropriation,
Falschübersetzung
or
und diese
wrong
unabsichtliche oder
translations, so
absichtliche
willful or
Fehlübersetzung
accidental
kann natürlich auch eine Form der
mistakes
Begeisterung
in
sein.
translations. That can
Deutscher
also be a
Hip-Hop
form
zum
of
Beispiel, eine
enthusiasm.
entsetzliche
German hip hop, for
aber
example, is a
letztlich
horrible
irgendwie,
mistranslation.
gut, das will ich jetzt nicht
But
weiter beurteilen,
well,
aber
I don't want to
sozusagen im kulturpopulären
judge
Bereich
that.
kommt es
But
natürlich immer
in
wieder
pop
zu
culture,
Aneignung.
again and again,
Das ist für mich auch ein
appropriation
Punkt, den ich
happens,
wichtig finde,
and
auf den
that's
der
a point
Literaturwissenschaftler Christian Metz
to me,
hingewiesen
where
hat
the
im
literary
Zusammenhang
scientist
mit der
Christian
Übersetzungsdebatte.
Metz talked
Es
about
ändert sich,
when it
wenn
comes to the debate about
ein
translation.
Text zur Ware
If
wird.
a
Es ändert sich
text
dann, wenn die Sache
becomes
weiterverkauft wird, wo
a
man sich
traded
dann fragen
good,
muss,
it
wer verdient
changes.
jetzt
If a text is
eigentlich
sold on,
daran?
if
Und
you have to
dann
ask
gehört
yourself
eben auch
who
dies
is making money with
zu
this
dem
text, then
Kontext
it
der
changes.
Übersetzung.
And that is also part of translation.
Mit der gewissen Überraschung, dass die deutsche Übersetzung dann bei Hoffmann und Kamper erschienen ist und
And it's a
lange
bit
Zeit
surprising
auf der
that the German
Internetseite
translation was published at
aufgerufen hat,
Hoffmann and
direkt als
Kampe.
Spitzentitel
And when
neben
you
der
opened
Kandidatin stand.
the
Das
website,
versetzt einem dann doch so einen leichten
my
Schauder.
work was right next to the candidate. And that sent shivers down my
Angeregt durch die
spine.
Fragen habe ich mich jetzt etwas von meinem Skript
So
entfernt, aber
I
ich konnte so viele
listen to your
Fragen
questions,
ganz unbeantwortet
and
stehen
I am
oder
not
zumindest
just reading out my script
versucht,
anymore
sie ein
because
wenig
I
anzureißen.
want to touch on the many questions that you
Der,
mentioned.
der deutsch-indische Germanist Anil Bhatti hat darauf
Anil
hingewiesen,
Bhatti already
dass
pointed out the following thing.
der Versuch, etwas ganz genau zu verstehen,
They said that if you attempt to understand
häufig
something
auch eine Form von
exactly,
Aneignung sein
that
kann.
attempt in itself can already be
Eine
a form of
Die
appropriation.
Ähnlichkeit als
And
kulturtheoretisches Paradigma
if
der
you look at
Differenz zur
similarity
Seite
as a
gestellt.
cultural paradigm,
Das Verstehen des anderen ist keine Garantie für den
then
friedlichen Umgang
understanding
mit dem
the other
anderen, sagt
doesn't.
Bhatti. Nun ist natürlich
Bhatti
das
says if you
Unverständnis auch
understand
keine
the other,
Garantie
that
für den
doesn't mean
friedlichen
that you
Umgang
can
mit
live
dem
in peace
anderen.
or coexist.
Sozusagen
So understanding is not key
Unverständnis
here. But
zu
the
begreifen,
own
nicht zu
misunderstanding,
leugnen,
we have to understand what we
Lesern,
misunderstand.
Leserinnen einer
We
Übersetzung
mustn't
die
deny
Möglichkeit
it.
zu geben,
We
ihr eigenes
need to
Unverständnis
enable readers of a
einzutragen
translation to
oder
misunderstand the
es
text
eben
in their own
durch
personal way.
einen beigegebenen kritischen Apparat zu
And
erhellen. Und ich bin eine
maybe
sehr
we can add
große Freundin
a
dieser
specific
kritischen Apparate, die
critical
ÜbersetzerInnen einem
addition
Buch
in a book.
schenken und
So
habe darin schon
I'm a big
enorm
fan, a big
viel
supporter of
gelernt und lese
translators
sie manchmal sogar als erstes
adding
und erst
critical
dann
notes
die
for readers. I often
Übersetzung.
read those critical notes of the translators first, even before I
Das
read the translation
Unverständnis
in
kann
itself.
also einen
So
Anteil daran
misunderstanding
haben,
or
wie ich
just
übersetze
plain not understanding
und
can have a
sollte
part in the
letztlich
way that I
einer
translate,
guten Form
and
des Umgangs
it
dienen.
should serve a good
Ich glaube,
form
damit habe ich
of
etwa 5 Minuten
coexistence.
gesprochen.
And I think that's my 5 minutes, right?
Vielen Dank, Monika Rinck.
Thank
Sie haben
you,
ganz viele
Monika
Sachen
Rinck.
aufgegriffen,
You touched
auf die
on
wir
many
hoffentlich auch
different
gleich noch
elements
zu sprechen kommen
that
und
we would
die
love to
Teil
come
der
back to.
Inputs hier der beiden
They are
Kollegen
going to
sein
be
werden.
part of the
Ich möchte jetzt
inputs
dich
of the
bitten,
next of the two colleagues that we have
Şahin
here,
Kürküt,
Şahin Kürküt.
deinem
I would like
Input-Referat
to ask you to read your presentation. Şahin Kürküt was born in Yarhaka. He studied philosophy in Bonn. He finished his master's degree with a focus on philosophy of language. At the same time, he trained as a teacher for Kurdish, and since 7 years he teaches Kurdish. He's actually my Kurdish teacher. I'm one of his students. And in this summer, he received a stipend for the translation of a theater book into Kurdish. And for the project Droste, he also translated poems into Kurdish. I think you write poems yourself, right? You translate poems, you translate plays, you work for different media, and yeah, you translate into Kurdish, or rather into Kurmanji. What is Kurdish, actually? There's South Kurdish, Kurmanji, there's different dialects, different languages. I think you're going to go into that, right? Yes. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Today we have very interesting panel questions that I have dealt with in my work of translating into Kurdish, and I'm very happy to be able to talk with you about those different aspects. But first, I want to give you some background on my input so that you understand what thoughts are behind that here. So what language are we talking about? I'm talking about the Kurdish language from the perspective of a Kurdish translator. So I asked the question, what is the relationship of the Kurdish language with translations? It's a language that has about 40 million native speakers. Those 40 million people are distributed among 4 different nation states in the order of largest to smallest. That is Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And these states can also be described as colonial powers. In all 4 countries, Kurds encounter more or less state oppression, such as bans on Kurdish language and cultural activities, assimilation, political persecution, and violence. What is known is veiled, is hidden away. What does that mean for translators? We think that we can understand a lot here, but especially when it comes to Kurdish language and translation into Kurdish, many things remain hidden away. So, about the panel question, can translation live up to the expectation of acting as a mediator between cultures? That's a beautiful romantic notion. It can be used to draw the image or metaphor of a bridge, or in the context of colonial times, the image of a ship exploring new lands and cultures and returning home with rich experiences and new horizons. Ludwig Wittgenstein said in his philosophical investigations, and I quote, "An image held us captive, and we could not escape, for it lay in our language, and it only seemed to repeat itself to us relentlessly." This sentence relates well to the images described above, or to the idea of translation as a cultural mediator. The longer we feed unilaterally on these images, the sweeter and the more harmless this one-sided contemplation of this image becomes. So, if we ask what is translation, we should rather ask, how does it work? How is it needed? And if we do that, we will recognize that translators can also be a tool of power. Translating doesn't only tear down boundaries, it also constructs new boundaries. It not only offers the new possibility of presentation, but also accelerates acculturation. Translation is not impartial or innocent. It's always about perception and interpretation of a specific worldview. and that worldview is embedded in the complex being and acting of a specific language space. That means that by translation you automatically ostracize. That starts with the choice of works that you are going to translate, but it doesn't stop there. A translator that has been socialized in a colonial state has already absorbed all that, unconsciously or consciously. So if you take away the identity of, if you make a language nameless or even mutilate it, that's also a factor of translation. An example, in the translation of Salman Rushdie's book, The Enchantress of Florence, into Turkish, the word Kurdistan was deleted by translators and interpreted differently. Terms such as Kurdish settlement areas were used. In the German translation, it says Kurdistan in German as well. Second example, in the 2004 translation of Paulo Coelho's work Once Minutos into Turkish, words were adapted again. In German, it says Kurds come from Kurdistan, which is a region in the north of Turkey and in the south of Iraq. And in the Turkish version, it says Kurds who live in the Middle East. So the translating practice in Turkey was used to make Kurds nameless, hide them away, or even mutilate them by the verbal translation or written translation. In the Turkish parliament, there's interpreters translating into Arabic, Russian, French, and so on, but no one interprets into Turkish. So at first sight, this could be interpreted as a purely political measure. However, you can see how Kurdish is rendered nameless by the fact that Kurdish contributions or words are not recorded in the very parliamentary minutes. When someone speaks Kurdish, in the minutes it says unknown language, incomprehensible. Third example, the Kurdish epic or love drama from the 17th century, Memuzin, by Emede Khani, was only translated in 2010 into Turkish. It was translated during the peace process between Turkey and the Kurds, and that peace process actually failed after 4 years. It was the first Kurdish book in history to be translated into Turkish at the behest of the Turkish Ministry of Culture. Beforehand, only a few Kurdish amateur translators had managed to translate parts of the book into Turkish. In the process, some verses were censored for political reasons. And with this hegemonic act, the Kurds were expected to just be satisfied. But the translation was a fiasco. The paradox was the following thing. A Turkish professor, not a Kurdologist, was charged with translating the epic into Turkish. An academic who interprets Kurdish as a dialect of Persian did the translation. That professor didn't know to speak Kurdish at all. Thus, for the translation, he just copied translations of others. And that is visible because typos and translation mistakes are reflected in his translation 1-to-1. Fourth example, Kurdish songs were taken over and partly declared as Turkish cultural property. The authors and singers of the original songs were made unrecognizable by using expressions such as regional song, anonymous source, or unknown source. And that practice is behind many cultural assets. So, my remarks today are only a small piece of the puzzle. Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria face similar conditions. And the Kurdish language is politically very charged, and translation cannot free itself from that. at least not easily. But translators can contribute to adjusting their work or their standard in translating in the best possible way through continuous training and international exchange. And that doesn't only include the dualism with the source text, but also with the target text. It also takes the different language regions into account.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we can see that it really also depends on how the translator is instrumentalized, whether there's a target behind a translation or, like what Ms. Rinck said, it has to be it has to be integrated in a sales process. The publishers also have to join the discussion. They might want to change something in a translation that the translator wouldn't have intended him or herself. So it's not just the political claim behind it, but it's also a matter of sales, a sales factor. I always thought that I was a translator, that I built bridges to other cultures. And now you sort of deconstruct that image in my head. Maybe even more so now with your presentation on building those bridges. Professor Johannes Salim Ismaiel-Wendt. He's professor for musical sociology and popular music studies at the University of Hildesheim. He was born in Stadtlohn, so not far from here. You're from Westphalia, from the Münsterland, born and raised here. Studied cultural sciences, sociology, and musical sciences at the University Bremen. That's also where you received your PhD from 2010 to 2012. He worked as a scientific consultant at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt Berlin in the projects translating hip-hop. Ms. Rinck also mentioned hip-hop. Maybe we can talk about that after the presentation. And global prayers. He also gives sound lectures. I'd love to hear more about that, where he combines his work as a scientist and as a musician. Ever since 2012, he's been teaching at the University of Hildesheim, and in 2013 he gave a workshop to do with the 10 years since Edward Said died. His research focus is in popular music, Musik macht Dinge, and post-colonial analysis. For the Trans-Droste project, he concepted an audio feature. We heard that yesterday with the title Heavily Laden, with the treasures from the Orient in Westphalia. And it looks at Annette von Droste-Hülshoff's project Sounds from the Orient. What are Musik macht Dinge? Is that something special? Yes, it's a term that I coined in 2016 for a book. It's sort of an extended term for musical instruments. But I don't like to call it a musical instrument, because that, for me, it sounds like instruments are just something that is an extension to our own arm. But now we have all these electronical music makers, music-making thing, and they know more about music than the people who work with them. That's why I call them Musik macht Dinge, things that you do music with, that you make music with. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yes, I'd love to get started straight away with Ferhat Tun. I interviewed him 10 years ago about his arrest in Turkey, because he sang in Kurdish, and apparently he sang in an unknown language. That was the problem. And of course, with Monika Rinck, I'd love to talk to you about hip-hop, but I wrote down 7 things, and I'm just going to read them out. They were mentioned in the last days by Özkan, by others, and maybe I'll just summarize it quickly because it has been mentioned again and again. So the first 4 things are sort of pessimistic regarding the question whether translation can be a mediator between cultures. I do not believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages. If that goes hand in hand with understanding languages as a marker for certain cultures, I don't believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages if it involves trivializing the constellations of power, colonialism, violent oppression in the context of language. I don't believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages if it goes hand in hand with thinking cultures essentialistically or ethno-culturally, as Mecheli would call it. I don't believe in building cultural bridges by translating languages if it goes hand in hand with thinking cultures rigidly and not seeing intracultural differences as at least as diverse as the differences between supposed cultures. So, yeah, that was a bit pessimistic maybe, but yeah, I was born in the Catholic Münsterland. That's what we learn here. It's normal for us. It's sort of a manifest for me. I want to look at it from a more productive perspective. Translation can be thought productively, and Monika Rinck has talked about it. If translation is perceived as a basic cultural experience. We talked about that yesterday. Also, if translation takes several categories and ways of perception in their interconnectedness, class, race, gender, religion, I don't think we talked about that enough in the last days. Able, disabled. These categories are at least as important, and we have to take them into account when it comes to building bridges. They're equally important as language. And translation can be thought productively if non-understanding or if supposed translation errors, if being translate, so being late, is seen as a creative impulse for encounter. And as part of my input, I brought a pop song along by Kyo. It's quite old, from 2007. I wrote a lot about that song. The song is called Bratwurst. And I want us to all listen to the song at least briefly because it's an example for me for productive misunderstanding. And in the song, Kyo, a German female rapper from Germany, raps in English, in a very strange English, one could say. Kaiser Komkowski, a Norwegian musician, joins her, and Darius James, an Afro-American songwriter and poet, and they sort of take this song to deal with their cliches about German language. Let's give it a...
Zack, zack, schnell, schnell, schnell.
Jawohl, Frau General. Ach du lieber. Was ist jetzt?
Q for Quatsch, I for Eisbein, O for Automata.
Eisbein.
Q for Quatsch, I for Eisbein, O for Automata. I've just come home to Berlin. My head spins like I'm hurling off a water schleudern.
Mein Gott, Walter.
My digestion's unessential. It's depressing.
Deutsche Seele. Huh?
My digestion's unessential. Where's my Walter von der Vogelweide potential?
Walter von der Vogelweide?
America is guilty.
Ah, mein Hase.
Oh, I feel so filthy. My cultural disconnection, a permanent infection. My heritage, my image, threw it in the sewage. Zack, zack, schnell, zackig, zackig. Jawohl, schnell, schnell. Alle ourselves feel happy and at home. Rakete.
V5N, ein V5N1.
I'm niggity nothing but a zombie, miggity molded into Gumby. Yes, I admit unhumbly, friggity Fritz's ways are bumpy. He cannot be polite, higgity, his soul is dark as night.
Zack, zack, schnell, schnell, alles Quatsch.
Haha, but they're bumpy, bumpy, bumpy.
Dein Po ist knackig. Du bist schöne Frau. Super Busen über alles.
When I finally found I send spaces, glue my Adidas to the ground. I'm still chaos, find myself neither disciplined nor orderly. This line should be longer, but it's growing thin. You say, I say,
Eisbein.
you say, Rache, I say,
Eisbein über alles.
I'm pushed into the Stein of when like Hans and Greater line until I'm knackig.
Eisbein über alles.
Eisbein,
Heißt im Grunde
typical German
genommen,
dish.
werden diese Klischees,
So German
verfestigt,
cliches
beziehungsweise
are
auf die
sort of
Schippe genommen.
strengthened, or actually it's a bit of a humoristic approach as well. What are we doing with that? So when does language work?
Ja, Frau Rinck, bitte.
Ms. Rinck, please.
So eigenartig, sich irgendwie aus der Ferne zu Wort zu
It's
melden
very
und
strange to join you from afar because I never even know if you can hear me. Yes, we can hear you, we can see you.
Ich denke, es ist auch wichtig zu
I think it is
unterscheiden, ob ich es
important
mit
to
einer
to
ästhetischen
differentiate
Übersetzung
between
zu
an
tun habe,
aesthetic
während ich
translation,
sozusagen Irritationsverstörung,
where
Mehrdeutigkeit genießen kann,
irritation can be
oder
something
eben
that
einem
we
anderen
enjoy or
Text,
ambiguity,
Gebrauchstext und
or whether
möglicherweise
we
zu
look at a
einem
different sort of text, like
Gerichtsprotokoll,
maybe
wo
a
es dann
legal
sozusagen-
text,
also
a protocol,
wollte ich noch
a court
nachfragen,
protocol,
sozusagen dieses Umarmen des
because to
Unverständnisses
embrace the
ist
things
etwas,
we don't
was in
understand,
einem
that is
ästhetischen
something that, yes, in an
Zusammenhang oder in einem
aesthetic
Zusammenhang,
context
wo
can make
Leute
sense, or
miteinander umgehen,
in a
das auch
context
gleichzeitig als
where
spielerisch begreifen
people
kann,
sort of
natürlich eine
understand it
andere
as a
Sache
game, as
als,
something playful. That's very different
wenn ich
from other
offenkundige
situations when it's
Übersetzungsfehler
really
mir begegnen,
about
die dann in
transferring
Asylverfahren
information,
direkt
you know,
irgendwie
things that can have an
Einfluss haben auf das
impact
Schicksal einer Person.
on the life of people, like in asylum
Da wollte ich
cases
vielleicht
in
ganz
front of the
kurz
court.
noch auf ein Projekt
And
hinweisen, dass
that is
das,
why I wanted to mention a
literarisch-deutsch-arabische
project that's the
Literaturkollektiv
literal
Devise
German
gerade,
Arabic
macht.
cultural
Und zwar,
archive Devise,
versucht das
and that
Literaturkollektiv
is
Devise den Al-Khatib-Prozess in Koblenz,
they
der
try
auf
to
dem
follow
Weltrechtsprinzip basiert.
the Al-Khatib
Das
trial in
2002 zum
Koblenz,
ersten Mal in
a
Deutschland in
trial
Kraft
against
trat.
alleged perpetrators suspected of so-called
Wo man
state torture in
Verbrechen,
Syria.
schwerste Verbrechen, Völkermord
And
und
yes,
Kriegsverbrechen eben an unterschiedlichen Orten
crimes like genocide can now be brought to court
dort wird
in
gerade
different
gegen einen
places.
Verdächtigen der
And
syrischen
at the
Staatsfolter,
moment, there is a case
prozessiert.
against,
Und
one
es
of
gibt aber
an alleged perpetrator. But
es gibt die Fragen zum Beispiel der
the
Richterin
questions of
werden
the
übersetzt, aber die arabische Übersetzung ist selten zu hören. Und deswegen
of the
fährt jeweils
judge, they are
ein
translated,
arabisches und ein deutschsprachiges Mitglied
and
der
there's
diese
usually
schreiben
an Arabic
schreiben
and a
wird. Und das ist
German
sozusagen die
translator,
einzige
and they
Schrift,
take
die es
notes.
auch
But that's
sozusagen
the
in beiden
only
Sprachen
protocol
gibt,
that exists in both
weil es keine
languages,
zweisprachigen Protokolle
because
gibt
there are
dort
no
in Koblenz. Und
bilingual
die
protocollants
haben mir
in
auch berichtet, dass
Koblenz.
es,
And what I heard, what they
natürlich, wenn ich
told
einen
me is that
nordafrikanischen Übersetzer
if you
habe,
have
der
a
syrisch-arabisch
translator
übersetzt
from
hat,
Northern
wird er
Africa
Schwierigkeiten
who
haben.
translates
Und all
Syrian
diese
Arabic, then
Fragen,
he will
die
have
eigentlich gar nicht klar
difficulties,
machen,
and
was
all
je
those
nachdem
questions that
sehr
maybe
eminent
people don't even
politisch
are aware of and that
Prinzip
have to
eines
do with the
Weltrechtsprinzips
political principle of a
einhergehen.
world
Also
right
wie kann
principle.
ich
They go
da
hand in hand in that with that. And
übersetzerisch dazu
how
beitragen, dass es
can
wirklich zu
we
einer
as
Art von
translators
Wahrheitsfindung
make
kommt?
sure that we find the
Und
truth
das
in the
wiederum wäre
end?
dann zu unterscheiden von
And yes, we have to distinguish that
dem
from
Versuch, auch ästhetische Undeutlichkeiten
trying
in einer
to
Sprache nachzubauen, die man in einer anderen Sprache
reconstruct aesthetic misunderstandings in an enjoyable way. So that would be translating at courts. We are talking about translation in general, literature translation, what you also worked with. But nonetheless, I would like to ask you to maybe just talk to us about your project. It has to do with translating and interpreting at a court case, and you talk about how that can lead to problems and lack of dignity.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. That is eminently important. It's not as it was in the song we heard, everything is circus and can just break down at one point in time, it doesn't matter. What you pointed out reminds me of a project where we work with an audio collective that's called ARC, and in 2017 I participated in the trial of the NSU, the right-wing terror group in Germany, and I declared myself an expert because I looked at the use of microphones within that trial, and I looked at how is the translation being taken care of, who needs to wear a headset, who hears the original witness in their original language, who hears the interpretation. That is quite important in this case. And what was the mistakes? What were the mistakes that happened there? So I watched the trial. I looked at the first 350 protocols. I searched the protocols for segments where a microphone was used, where it was about language. So there's a judge, for example, and the judge has a switchboard, and that judge can switch microphones on and off, and there's about 80 microphones in that hall. So there's many microphones, but the translator and the witness need to share a microphone, and the audience members in the gallery, for example, can't hear what the witness says because you only hear the translation over the loudspeakers. So that was fascinating to see. And in that case, that translation and the way it was implemented was very politically Latin. That's just an example. That reminds me of a Turkish light culture, a Turkish dominant culture that goes against Kurdish. You translate into Kurdish. Could you tell us about how you personally and your network of translators, how you work? Kurdish, you said, is a language that is not being taken care of because it's forbidden in the national states where Kurds live. So what do you do? What can you do? Is it just translating plays? Is that maybe a beginning? Well, here we can't really do much. We don't have a real network. We are still responsible for our families who still live in Kurdistan. And that is very important. I was not able to get proper training here on how to translate into Kurdish. I was not able to get proper training on how to teach Kurdish. Those possibilities didn't exist. Like learning that at university, that's not possible. In Kurdistan, it's forbidden, and here it's not possible. Not that much has happened here, even though there's 1.3 million Kurds living in this country. So we don't really have the institutions. We don't have an institutional basis for the Kurdish language here. Everyone does what they can, and that's it. But there is this publishing house that was founded in Diyarbakir, and they translate literature from many languages into Kurdish. So there are attempts to support, to strengthen Kurmanji. Sorani is a bit stronger anyway, as I understand it, because Sorani is, there's more translations into Sorani and there's more Kurds writing in Sorani, right? Yes. There in South Kurdistan, we have a state structure, really. Sorani is an official language there. And so there's a lot of support for Sorani, but for Kurmanji, that doesn't exist. And maybe about your question, what is Kurmanji? Why do we call it that? Kurmanji and Sorani are the two big dialects of Kurdish. We also call it North Kurdish, that's Kurmanji, and Sorani is South Kurdish. There's also a dialect, or it's Middle Kurdish, and there's also a group of dialects that are considered South Kurdish. There is another dialect, but that's a bit disputed. Many say this is not a dialect, this is its own language. So there's 4 big groups of dialects, and 60% of Kurdish-speaking people speak Kurmanji in 4 parts of Kurdistan. So that was maybe just a short overview. So there's not a lot of Kurmanji literature, there's very few translations into Kurmanji, so there's many languages that were not translated or that is not translated into, and those decisions are political decisions, and that is also visible when we look at the list of Nobel laureates for literature. There's one person who received the Nobel Prize for literature who was Arabic speaking. That was in 1987. And that's the only Nobel Prize for an Arabic speaker, even though there's many Arabic authors. And the 100 best books as selected by Dennis Scheck, there's 1001 Nights is in there. Dubran Khalil is in there. It's a Lebanese who emigrated to the USA and writes in English. There's not a single Arabic language author on there. There's not a single Turkish language author. And of course, no Kurdish language author. How can we, and that question goes to you as well, Ms. Rinck, because you deal with language so much, how can we change this? How can we move the majority of society to be more sensitive when it comes to those decisions? When someone is chosen for a Nobel Prize for Literature, this year it was Gurna, but he writes in English. So how can we actually raise awareness for the majority of society that there is a world of literature that we just don't know? And the fact that there's no awards being handed out to authors in that language doesn't mean that that literature doesn't exist. What can we do here? That's a very difficult question. I often say that untranslatability is a societal or a money problem, not a lexical problem. Often it's about, can you even translate this poem? Oh, do you even have a word for that? How would you say Gemütlichkeit in English? That to me is just folklore. The problem is a lot deeper. How do I get to know something that I don't know, that it exists? There are people who have that knowledge, who can pass that knowledge on, and they need to be more present. So the public is being diversified there at the moment. At the same time, there's a lot of defense against those new developments. There are processes that have many conflicts within them. I would say be more careful about who can we ask about this. Taking care of that and then really asking. I don't know if the International Festival even has a future, but for many international festivals, it's always the same people who are there. It's always the same people from different countries. It's often poets, it's often three poets, often three male poets from the African continent that are invited again and again and again. They are already translated, they are known, and they are invited. But if you actually pay attention here, if you want to reflect the international scene and then you always only invite a very small part of that international scene, then yeah, that doesn't really change anything. I always try to pay attention here. I always try to tell people about it. When I have found texts, authors, books, for example, where I think so many more people need to know this exists, and I hope that that is then passed on. This afternoon, we had a panel, and there we talked about 1001 Nights, and the colleague who translated Droste into Persian said that he believes that Droste read 1001 Nights. I think she probably read 1001 Nights and not the Divan, but maybe she read both. But the cliches from 1001 Nights are cliches, are stereotypes that we translators who translate into Arabic, those cliches are still influencing us today. We still have the impression that we need to fight against those cliches, be it the cover of a book, be it critiques of books. Critiques often mention 1001 Night, even though the entire book has nothing to do with it, even if it's a modern novel, for example. You deal with colonialism and post-colonialism. What would you say? What would be your proposal? How can we raise awareness? How can we teach people that everything Arabic isn't 1001 Night, even if it's still read to children? That still happens, but it's not a depiction, it's not a representation of Arabic literature. I don't have a real answer to that, but I would like to ask a question. What would the real Arabic literature be? And can we imagine that literature without Goethe, without Rücker, without Droste-Hülshoff, if you like? That is something that just came to me when you said this is an African author, but he writes in English. I think we need to accept, we definitely need to accept today that this is their family language. It is their mother tongue. That is part of all this. And a person from India once told me, what? Cricket isn't an English sport? Look at how bad they are at it. The only ones who are as good as we is Jamaica. So that colonial history that is interconnected with that sport, and that is something that the formerly colonized appropriated for themselves, and now they act on it independently. And I think that is something that we need to accept. If someone from Africa writes in English, then that person very probably writes in their favorite language. They write in the language they want to express their thoughts in. I just want to point out one thing, and I also tried to say that in my statement. We mustn't connect languages with specific cultures. We must accept that there's different phases of globalization. As Ottmar Etter said, the day before yesterday, and that just accumulated over time. And I believe that we also need to take the step to recognize the following thing. Yesterday we talked about stable identities. That didn't sit well with me. I think it has become clear that we all don't have only one single identity. And it's not a problem if you feel you're a part of different cultures. You can be Turkish and Kurdish and German at the same time, or Palestinian and German at the same time. Gunnar lives in England, so it's his literary language, you're right. But I think we need to liberate ourselves from that understanding that person comes from that country, that's his language, and he's going to write in that language. We need to disconnect ourselves from that, and we need to maybe bring that into our literary work. Unfortunately, it's already 6:30, and we need to stop in time today. So, do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for these wonderful inputs. It was very enriching. It was lovely listening to you. And each input, for me as a literature scientist, was very rewarding for me. I don't really have a question. I just kind of want to emphasize a couple of things from my perspective. Şahin, when you talk about Kurmanji, the Kurdish language, when you talk about the situation in Turkey, and you're asked about what we can do, then my impulse from the audience was to get in there right now, because especially when it comes to this topic, we are not individuals. We have to act together, and you said that. And we need networks. We need to stand side by side. As somebody who is in that system, in the diaspora of the Turkish system, who's moving in that system, and who, of course, publicly wants to cooperate with you. But I think that that's a question that kind of hands over responsibility to the individual. And I don't want to say that we have no power, but I do want to emphasize that we have to make sure it's not on us alone. We can translate and we can form networks, but you pointed out, and right so, that it's not the case that you, even if you had the money, to do that, if you would want to spread the word, if you want to speak out about Kurdistan, that you can't do it because you are responsible for your family who is there, and they might be the ones to suffer the consequences. So all of this goes hand in hand with translation, and we are very far away from it. When I talk about the rights or the obligations of this country when it comes to the heritage of Turkish life in Germany, I now always try to integrate the Kurdish perspective. I try to say Turkish and Kurdish, but this also brings a certain risk, because me, as somebody from Turkey, I would then speak about the Kurdish life, and that is a bit risky. So if we show solidarity, if we stand by side, then that's a risk, but it also enables us to start a dialogue. What you also emphasized is that we have to focus more on dialogue. We have to talk about things. We have to ask directly. We have to be present. And as somebody who's originally from Turkey, I feel obliged to not just talk about Baykut, but to also talk about his opinion on the Kurdish question, to talk about these issues. And all that is highly political, And publishing houses still have a lot to do when it comes to opening up and saying, okay, let's focus on Kurdish diaspora literature. Let's stand up against what is happening in Turkey in the political sphere when it comes to the Kurdish. But it is also something that we have to focus on here in Germany, in the community, because there's not enough support. Usually here when we talk about Turkish life in Germany, well, we do also have to talk about Kurdish life. It's not as much a question, it's more of a feedback. I would like to thank all of you for this very interesting panel. I'm going to take so much away from that. Thank you very much. I think translation is not going to solve our problems. In order to fulfill that task, we need other tools and we need more time. But I think that this project, our project here, achieves so much. All of us are sitting here now in Droste's living room. We're sitting here together. We talk about translation. We talk about the Kurdish language. And I think not regarding content, but as translation can achieve so much. That's wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Monika. Rinck. Was so interesting listening to you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And yes, I would also like to thank everybody who helped us organize this event. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.